So Grokipedia is now at the point when it's starting to generate content. And I know a lot of people are going to listen to that and say, oh, that's wonderful, and that's great, and that's the next level. Okay, fine. I didn't delve into it too much. What are the sources? He died in the early 90s. He died before the digital era. All of his work was before the digital era. The article was certainly longer than anything I would have written based on the sources that I could find online, number one. Number two, what is there in print? In Washington, Encyclopedia of American Opera. That may be on Google Books. That's not digitized. So what's in there? Does Grok have access to that? I don't think it does. That's the question again about, you're talking about AI. It's all well and good for it to be able to read stuff that's been digitized, but what about the stuff that hasn't been?
Welcome to the table. You're tuned into the Academic Boardroom with Dr. J and Dr. E. Pull up a chair. Higher learning, higher stakes.
Welcome back to the Academic Boardroom, where we sit down with power brokers shaping the future of education. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Joseph, and today we are joined with and by the most prolific Wikipedia editor and administrator by the name of Steven Pruitt. He is the man, the myth, and the legend. Known by his pseudonym, Ser Amantio di Nicolao, Steven has made and produced more than 6 million edits to the English language site and created over 33,000 articles, which is more than anyone else in his 25-year history. Steven has been editing on Wikipedia since 2004. Since then, he has quietly become one of the internet's most influential figures. He is responsible for over 1/3 of all English language entries, ranging from historical biographies to fine-tuning grammar, citation, and layout. Steven, welcome to the boardroom.
Thank you. I do want to make one point, though, because that number about 1/3 has been out there for a while. I have touched 1/3 of the articles in the English Wikipedia. I have not actually formatted, created, written. I've just touched them. That could be something as little as changing a comma. But I want to get that right because, as I say, that number's been out there for a while, and it kind of gets wilder and scarier as it goes. So yes, I've had some kind of input, however small, in 1/3 of the articles on the English Wikipedia. Probably more at this point, though I'm not certain about that. But no, I haven't created them and formatted them. I'm also not sure. I am the most prolific editor. I'm not sure I'm the most prolific article creator. But I honestly, I haven't checked that in a while. So forgive me for jumping in with that. But I'm Wikipedian. I believe accuracy is important.
Yeah, yep, exactly. No worries. I wanted you to go back, way back, 2004, to when you said, you know what, I need to either edit, fine-tune, fact-check, or create a profile. I was wondering, what was your first profile that you have created? And I also wanted to understand why. Why was it needed to make that contribution?
So, and I'm sure a lot of folks, I'm 42, so I started college in 2002. So I'm sure a lot of folks in that age cohort have similar memories at this point. 2002, I would be doing research for something for class. And this thing, Wikipedia, kept showing up way down in the Google search results, like 20 or 30 down in line. And it kept saying the free online encyclopedia that anybody can edit. Yeah, sure, right. I can believe that. But it sounded too good to be true. But it was there, and it wouldn't stop being there. And so finally, after seeing that for a while, and I started to see it rising in the rankings and didn't go away. And I thought, well, maybe there is something to this. So I started tinkering with it. I don't really remember my first edits because they're under an IP address, or they're out there, but my history with them is lost. And then I said, well, let's try an article. And my first article, and I'm fully aware that this is nepotism, I'm also fully aware that I don't care, was about my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, who was a member of the Virginia militia during the American Revolution. Was notable enough. He's still remembered in to a certain degree in Central Virginia. There are a couple of historical markers with his name on them. Fascinating guy, which I'm not going to get into right now, but his name is Peter Francisco, if you want to look him up. And Peter was exactly the sort of person. First of all, he used to be in encyclopedias. If you look back through old encyclopedias in the 19th century, he has an entry. But secondly, he was the sort of person that tends not to get into general interest encyclopedias. American Revolutionary History. You'll have articles about George Washington. You'll have articles about the Continental Congress. But you won't have articles about people like Peter. And so I wrote the article, and frankly, I didn't expect it to stick. I wrote it, and I sort of said, okay, I'll hit create, and let's see how long this stays. And probably in, a week or so, I was expecting it to be deleted. Well, it's still there. I wrote a couple of other articles from similar sources, both about the revolution. There was one about a battle that he was involved in. There was one about Francis Salvador, who was one of the first, I believe he was the first Jew to be killed in the revolution. Great proponent of independence. Both of them still there. I mean, both of them have been rewritten considerably since, but they're still there. And that's when I started thinking, maybe there is something to this after all, because people aren't deleting these. People seem, whether they're well written or not, and I freely admit that they're my early work, they're not my best, but people seem okay with this being here. And I think that was, to me, that's one of the things that's so interesting about Wikipedia, is that it can contain so much more than a print encyclopedia. And here was your perfect example of that. Is that people who are important, who belong in the history books, but frankly, there isn't enough space in Britannica or the World Book to put everything. Here, you had space for everything, and so he was able to get them in, and sort of going from there. I was, in those early years, there was a lot of spitballing, figuring out and I know in the documentation you sent me, you're talking about notability and what notability means. In those early years, we were figuring a lot of that out. What's notable? How do you define notability? How do you find the sources for something that is notable? And it's very, very freewheeling almost. And I got in on a lot of that, especially in 2007, when I started to see the way to build up some content. And there's a user I always like to make sure I cite him, Dr. Blofeld. Dr. Blofeld and Ser Amantio, although I wasn't Ser Amantio at the time. We were looking, especially at geographical articles, about how to start building out a base of articles on geography, not just in the U.S. He's English, he's British, I'm American. But, we did a lot in France. We're looking at a lot of first-level geography in Italy, in Africa. I remember I did a lot in those early years, sort of trying to build a base for what's there. And some of the notability, and this is not just things I've worked on, you see it with a couple of other realms as well. Some of the stuff that we talked about is still in place. Some of the things that we've talked about and other editors talked about has been sort of demolished, gone by the wayside. It's been refined. And it's the nature of things. I mean, Wikipedia is turning 25 this year. I guess you would call some of that growing pains. And it's been interesting, and this perhaps is something we can go down the path with or not, to see it refine and mature itself, deciding what's next, what comes up next,
When it comes to information, do you think there should be more? Like we're missing, or we probably tip or we scratched the surface of the iceberg, or do we think there should be more information?
On Wikipedia, absolutely. There's tons of stuff missing. I don't have as much time to write articles as I'd like to anymore, but I can think about this all the time. I find sources and I make note of them. In the realms where we've made great strides, there's still a lot to do. But there's places, there's arenas where there's been hardly anything written. There's still a lot to look at. I was just the other day, I was reading some things on the Met Museum website, discovered, I think they're spruce gum boxes. It's a specific type of folk art unique to lumbermen in Maine. I don't know what kind of studies out there. There's comparatively little online. There's no article on Wikipedia, but it looks to me like it's something that you could, write a whole article about. And it's that sort of thing, in areas like folk art, for instance, which have not seen as much scholarly intervention over the years. I think there's still a lot to be done. The other thing, too, is we do not live in as much of a digital world on Wikipedia as we used to, but there's still great strides to be made in the world of undigitized information. There's print encyclopedias with thousands of entries that need to be reviewed. I know because I've got a couple of them around here. There's people whose entire biography is contained in the 18th century and the 19th century in newspapers, in diary entries. When people ask me what are some of the most interesting things you've written about, I point to there was an opera singer named Fanny Eckerlin in the early 19th century. Yes, she's in a couple of books. I found a one-line mention of her name in a book. But most of the article that I developed was based on digitized print sources in the 19th century, because you're able to trace a career. She sang in Italy. Two Italian universities have digitized their collections of librettos. And of course, the librettos from that time had a cast list in them. So because they digitized them, and then they cross-referenced them, all you do, click on her name, you've got a complete career in Italy from 1820 to 1840. Scale that up, how many singers there are. And that's just one little slice of the sort of thing that you can get down into. Will more be digitized? Of course it will, but the fact remains that there's a lot of history took place in the pre-digital era that's comparatively hard to trace online, just because most of what's recorded is recorded in print rather than in digital formats. That's always going to be something. I wouldn't call it a concern, but it's always going to be something I think editors need to be aware of. And it's also something we need to be aware of when we're talking about this, scaling up knowledge, scaling up information, and how much of this stuff is out there. That's always going to be in the back.
Yeah, it's interesting that gray area in terms of like where, and this is where I wanted to ask this question as far as like how do you define was notable, like notability as well? Because now it's if we're going back into the historical realm, it's like, okay, you know what? They may not have a article online, right? Or they may not have a few articles online. So it's like, what makes it notable? And that can be a gray area as well.
So the standard answer to that is there are notability guidelines. And there's different ones for different disciplines. There's different ones for different arenas. Because when I talk about refining things, for instance, there was a lot of discussion a couple of years ago about refining the sports notability guidelines. I'm not that into sports, but this was things like you have, let's say, a database of Olympic athletes, which is great. And therefore, everybody who's appeared in the Olympics is supposedly notable. What people were discovering is that among those notable athletes, you'll have an article that says something like, Benson, first name unknown, was an American cyclist. He competed at the 1906 Olympics. That's literally all we can know because we don't know his first name. We just know his last name. He competed for the United States. And if 1906, if I remember correctly, was the strange Olympics, which was mostly Americans because they were run by a consortium. There's the whole weird story there that don't get into. But my point being that it wasn't somewhere where you had as many foreign athletes coming in. So what do you do when that's literally all you've got? And so the rule migrated to, well, maybe if that's all you can say, put that in a database listing. So you don't remove the information. You just don't make it the subject of a single article. My own standard whenever I go for an article, generally speaking, is I don't like to move unless I have somebody with an encyclopedia entry from a print encyclopedia. Because that way I can always point if somebody complains to me and say, well, you know what? I'm not the only one who thinks this person is notable. Whichever so-and-so also thought this person was notable enough when compiling this encyclopedia. When I do, for instance, my music articles, I use the New Grove Well, I own the New Grove Encyclopedia of American Music, which is probably the ultimate arbiter on music. If somebody's in there, there's absolutely no reason, there's no way at all that they're not important enough to be subject of a Wikipedia article. So I like that because it sort of backs my judgment up. But the standard, and this is just for the baseline standard, is can you find 3 articles out there that are about the subject, that are substantially about the subject, because that says that 3 different people wanted to write about them. 3 different people writing about them, therefore, it shows they have interest in different places. It can be more nebulous than that sometimes, and I do think it is important sometimes to rely a certain amount on an editor's judgment if it's a proven editor, because not everybody shows sound judgment, but I think people who've been around long enough can feel the standard a bit in their bones, if you will. That's a very imperfect way of putting it, but they feel it, they understand it, and so they can work with it without maybe sitting down and slicing it bit by bit by bit by bit, that sort of thing.
Also, I want to make clear, like it's you can't write it yourself. I think some people could try to write their for the record, I do not have a Wikipedia profile.
Sure.
But I can't write a Wikipedia profile of myself.
Well, so I will say this: you can, but you'll get in a lot of trouble for it. Yeah. The truth about that sort of thing, to put it bluntly, is people cannot write objectively about themselves. In theory, you can write an article about yourself and prove your own notability, but I wouldn't recommend it. And a lot of people think they can do that because they don't have a feel for the notability guidelines.
It's interesting. And I noticed that, and this is what I read online, that some people try to hire someone else to write it.
Oh, yeah.
Wikipedia.
That's become a cottage industry.
Okay, yeah, that can cause some issues as well, in terms of.
Oh, there's a lot of issues. For one thing, the people that do that often, they'll make a great big promise and say, I'll write the article and I'll make sure it doesn't get deleted. No, you can't do that, because once you've written it, you don't get any. You get as much say as other editors. You write an article, other editors say it's not notable. Fine, you go ahead, you defend it as much as you want. Other editors say it's not notable, it can get deleted. First of all. Secondly, the part that nobody talks about is when an article is deleted, it can be recreated, but that history is still available, especially to administrators. And that means a lot of people are going to look at it with some certain suspicion, because it comes back. People are always going to say, why was this deleted in the first place? And sometimes it's innocuous. Sometimes it's somebody who maybe didn't hit the big time and has since hit the big time. And administrators like me can see the history of the deleted article, so we can always look at it and tell other people. But sometimes it's, there's always going to be a question, and it's going to make people more suspicious. And frankly, it's going to make it that much harder for the article to survive. So
it's interesting. I was wondering, since you've probably seen it all since 2004. I was wondering, do you know the difference? You can tell the difference between a marketing type of article and then a real historical value type of article as well.
Well, marketing articles tend to use a lot of the same buzzwords you see in resumes. I can't pick any specifically, but the language that I'm talking about. That mission driven. Focused on results. They talk about results and things like that. A more historically based article, or even for a living person, is less based on buzzwords and is more based on neutral language. Look, I see it in music, for instance, too. I'll see articles about opera singers where you can tell their publicists have gotten involved because they're using the kind of language they use on their websites, hailed by Opera News or quotes from critics, that sort of thing. That's very nice. That doesn't quite belong here, and that's the same in other realms as well.
I was wondering, as far as the turnaround time, and these are questions that are coming to mind right now. Freestyle. the turnaround time for someone or, an editor or an administrator to create an article or a profile and the time in which it gets approved? Is it an approval process, or is just if it's created? Just
Not necessarily. I mean, there is the articles for creation process, which can be quite lengthy because there's a long backlog and there are few volunteer editors. But you can jump directly in and write directly in main space yourself. That's what I've always done, for instance. Now, with the caveat being, if you're a new editor, you have to go through certain steps, which is, I don't know of all of them because they've been added since I started editing. So, but you have to do a series of smaller edits basically before you get the right to create an article. So when I started, IPs could create articles, but you can create it directly in main space. The trade-off there, if you're not sure of yourself, though, is that it's immediately vulnerable to deletion discussions and things. So, it goes right up there. The idea behind articles for creation, at least, is supposed to be that it gives you a safe space to sort of develop the article and work on the article, work on concerns. That's also where WikiProjects come into place, though. I'm a member of WikiProject Women in Red, and I still look at the discussion space there, and we'll frequently have editors come and say, I'm working on this. Can you help me? Tell me that I'm on the right track. Which, frankly, I think if you're not certain is a wise thing to do. Find people who know your subject. I get a few on my talk page. Will you look at this article? Well, no, I won't, because you're just picking me. I don't know this field. I can't talk to you about soccer. I can't talk to you about computer science. I don't know those things. I'd rather, and we also have the Wikipedia Tea House where you can go for advice, which is designed to be a comfort zone for newer editors as well. So there are places. But no, you don't have to wait through a lengthy process if you don't want to. And AFC notoriously tends to have a bit of a backlog because there aren't that many people there.
Okay, it's interesting. And being that you mentioned the project that you're working on, I read something that you were big on diversity and inclusion as far as men and women profiles that are published on Wikipedia. I think there was a big disparity when you first started.
Well, so when WikiProject Women in Red was founded, which is now going on close to 11 years ago, I think. And if you'll excuse me for one moment, I can actually this is my laptop. This is my working computer over here, which is why I turned my head. I can probably get those exact numbers for you. As of October 2014, only 15.53% of the biographies on English Wikipedia were about women. A milestone of 20% was reached in mid-December 2024, so just over 10 years. Now, a lot of people will look at that and say that's really slow progress. But when you think that English Wikipedia is, at this point, I think it's over 7 million articles. Yeah, it's over 7 million articles. That's not bad. That's a heavy lift. That's not bad. And as I say, that was in 2024. And right now it's 20.37% of biographical articles. Of course, there are a lot of historical reasons for that. Women have traditionally been marginalized, that women's contributions have been overlooked. And furthermore, it's sort of tangential, because I've always been interested in women's history as well. My senior project in college was on a woman artist. I was an art history major. I have encyclopedias, dictionaries of women artists, women musicians as well. So it's always been a realm that interests me. What is interesting now to see the scholarship that's trying to rewrite some of the gaps that have been there for a while. That women were maybe not involved in the center of world events, but they were involved sort of a little bit more on the fringes. But they were still involved, but history books didn't talk about them, and now historians are finding the names that have always been there and teasing them out and writing more about them. So that's part of it. And then part of it with Women in Red is writing on notable contemporary topics as well. Another interesting tidbit for you that literally, I think, happened as of 2 weeks ago. there was a paper. No, it's an article in the magazine Science. It says Wikipedia's gender gap has flipped for one group of scientists. There are now more articles about contemporary women biologists than there are about contemporary male biologists. And that's just, well, for one thing, I have a very good friend who's a science writer, and she told me, well, that's actually also a factor of the field. There are more women biologists than men now. But it's also a factor of what Women in Red has done, is it's encouraged writers to write more on living scientists. For instance, science in particular is an area where there's been a great deal of success, which I can't really speak to that much because I worked very hard in geology in college so that I didn't have to take any more science courses. Let's just put it away. I was and remain a humanities geek.
I was wondering, when a living person has passed on, it seemed as though Wikipedia acts so fast and instantaneous. I was wondering, is it I'm pretty sure there are people that are monitoring events very closely, but are there bots in there or that instantaneously?
No, there aren't bots, just people see obituaries. It's the thing. And I have actually noticed some instances where people don't get to it right away if it's somebody in a slightly more obscure topic, because there's a recent deaths list. And you can go on there and you might see somebody who, actually, let's see, it's probably been fixed, but there was a couple of days ago I saw somebody who was listed in recent deaths, but hadn't been updated in their article yet. Mostly it's just people keep an eye out, notice obituaries, because I think it's sort of a natural process. People see an obituary and they say, oh, that person sounds famous. Are they on Wikipedia? And then they go and look. Also, I've noticed that sometimes people don't get an article until their obituary appears. And so they're going to be listed as dead in the article anyway. There are editors, there are editors who basically do a lot of their work is in beefing up articles about recently deceased people. And actually, after somebody dies and an obituary is dropped, you can get a very good article out of that. That might be the one. There was a member of the Mississippi House. Somebody added his death date, but the rest of the article was in present tense, which has been changed. There's that sort of thing from time to time. Yeah, as just mostly obituary readers. That's the thing you'll find if you spend a lot of time watching Wikipedia. People have their slices of the world that they work on, and you can get somebody who maybe isn't that interested. Let's say isn't that interested in writing on women scientists, but trolls the obituaries every day looking for stuff. And that person writes very good articles about recently deceased people. You'll have somebody else who's into women's contributions to biology, writes very good articles about women biologists, and that's all they focus on. There's one editor in Women in Red. She does excellent work, almost exclusively in the realm of women in Caribbean politics, because that's her field of interest. She writes great articles. I could never touch them because she knows how to find the right sources and she knows how to develop them. And so some of the most substantial articles about women in Costa Rican history, I remember various Caribbean islands as well. She's written those. Wikipedia is very good at rewarding the hyper-focused editor. If you're willing to learn the rules, if you're willing to play by the rules especially, you can have an outsized impact in whatever field you want to work on. I'm more of a generalist. I freely admit that.
And I was wondering, with over 6 million edits, I was wondering what portion is it fact checking or editing? What's the portion in terms of, if you can, estimate?
The vast majority of what I do is things like categorization and template editing and things. The little back end stuff that always needs to be done. I'll change errors when I see them. When I try to catch them when I can. But there's just so much back end work that has needed to be done over the years that I found I had an knack for it and I fell into it. So it's not as exciting as it seems. I would like more time to go back to article writing, which I tried to do some this year, but it takes a very different focus and a very different amount of time.
Okay. And speaking of time, I was wondering, how much time do you spend in terms of working on articles or making contributions to Wikipedia? Is it about a few hours in a day, or whenever you get a
Well, it's
chance?
2 or 3 hours nominally. Now, what frankly happens a lot, especially lately, is that I fall asleep after dinner, and so I fall asleep for most of that time instead of actually doing the edits. But I try to at least do a couple of edits a day, to keep the chain going. But yeah, on a day like today, I can theoretically get through a couple of thousand. Used to be 3 or 4 thousand when there was a lot more to do. In theory, you can still get through 3 or 4 thousand if the things are there to be done. But really, mostly now it's maybe 1,000 on a good day.
And I was wondering, I'm pretty sure you get this question all the time. Where you are now is pretty much, I'm not sure if you thought about being where you are now when you first started editing. But I was wondering if there was one or two advice or two different lessons that you've learned over the years that you could tell yourself 15, 20 years ago, what would it be?
Well, the first thing, of course, is that you stick to anything long enough, you pick up a lot of time. I didn't really think a lot in those early years about longevity of the project. It used to be able to pretty easily find individual statistics, some tools that have died since, I think. And I was sort of active up until about the beginning of 2007. Then I pulled back a bit and then I started up in earnest. I don't really know. In terms of Wikipedia, there's anything that I told myself because I try to take it as it comes. As we're talking about, there's been a lot of changes in the project in the past few years, and of course there are going to be more. And I think there are things coming that we need to be prepared to address, even if we haven't, changed them. AI being the most obvious one, which of course there is already a plan for, which is to say LLM contributions to articles are grounds for instant banning. But I've tried to take as much of it as it comes because, I you become aware the more editing you do that a lot of things are not mutable. That things are going to be changing more and more the further you go. And you're talking like, for instance, we were talking about notability guidelines. Certainly the notability guidelines, a lot of them were in place when I started and are no longer there. So you just have to roll with them. You can't be too rigid. I've seen editors flame out because they've been insistent on being too rigid. And that maybe that's the one lesson I would point to more than anything else is allow yourself a little more flexibility than maybe you think you need to.
Sounds great. I have another question here that I wanted to ask as far as, you read articles, tons of articles and books, and you're well versed in terms of what you know. Do you think there should be a balance when it comes to peer reviewing and how we do it in academia in terms of peer review articles and, reading what's factual in terms of methods and results and analysis, and also adding in like what the public knows about a particular article or a subject? Do you think there should be a balance between peer reviewing process and whether it's through empirical analysis, and also the public, what the public knows in terms of, articles being read and the information being passed down?
Is this on Wikipedia, you mean, or more in the
Yeah,
academic
yeah,
world?
yeah. No, in Wikipedia.
Um, I think uh, I think each portion of that question has a different part to play. Let's put it that way. The thing about the academic realm on Wikipedia is academia has access to so much more information than the average editor is ever going to get in touch with. I remember a comment somebody made once, so that writing for Wikipedia and writing for the Academy are two different styles. And I think that is true in the sense that in academia, you have the ability to do deep dives into a particular section of a topic that maybe you can't do when you're writing for general interest. But absolutely, I think the Academy can provide all kinds of sources, all kind of information that people like me don't easily immediately have access to, for instance. For the public, I think Wikipedia's strength remains that it's freely accessible and anyone can contribute. Now, again, I often hear people complaining about, well, I tried to do this and I wasn't allowed. No. If you follow the rules, you have to follow the rules. But if you follow the rules, you can go very far. But where it continues to thrive, especially to me, this is actually, I don't know, I can't say it's something I've thought a lot about, but this is something that's been on my mind a bit more recently. Because oftentimes the fights on Wikipedia are about current events. Yes, I understand why that's the case, but let's be honest, you also have other avenues for learning about current events if you want to. Where Wikipedia can thrive, and I don't think we always realize this necessarily, is in the more obscure topics. Making data about medieval Italian military commanders or early African history, let's say, or the independence wars in South America, making that freely accessible. Again, specialized topics where the Academy can come into play. But it always needs to be grounded in the understanding that the public, it needs to be publicly understandable and publicly accessible. I don't mean to be critical of academics, but I find that sometimes academics get so focused on writing and buzzwords and things because they're writing for their own audience, that it becomes something that's very difficult for the public to access. I think if you can come to a point where that is blunted, where that is sort of toned down a bit, make it more easily accessible for the public, I think, well, for one thing, I think the public will have a better view of the process and will have a better view of academia in general. But more importantly, it makes things understandable, makes things legible for people. Because ultimately, I think, I'm a great believer in individual betterment by learning. The best thing you can do for yourself is expand your mind, expand your understanding of the world, and anything you can do to make that easier and more accessible, I think, is all for the good. So Grokopedia, when it started, I was asked. We have a Wikipedia internal newsletter. I was asked to look at it for the newsletter. It's called Signpost. I didn't really want to, but the editors are nice people, and I wanted to be nice to them, and I said so. I did, and back at the time, of course, I think Grok was pulling Wikipedia articles and sort of improving on them, and the idea was that it was pulling in the legitimate sources, but also illegitimate sources, and therefore it was pulling in stuff that wasn't. Some of it was incorrect, some of it wasn't wrong, but it wasn't stuff that necessarily belonged or was properly sourced. But at the time, I said, yeah, this thing there's a lot of gaps. I spent a lot of time focusing on 19th century Italian opera, and I looked up several singers. And okay, one can argue Fanny Eckerlin, maybe she's a niche interest, but I remember I looked up 2 or 3 of the A+ singers of the era. People who, if I'm doing Opera 101 in college, I'm going to say 2 or 3 names you need to know, and these are the ones. They weren't there. And then they were there. Now, but this American composer, I don't remember his name, I looked him up in general. I just did a Google search because he came up in some of my reading. And there's a Grokopedia article. But I don't think there ever was a Wikipedia article. So Grokopedia is now at the point when it's starting to generate content. And I know a lot of people are going to listen to that and say, oh, that's wonderful, and that's great, and that's the next level. Okay, fine. I didn't delve into it too much. What are the sources? This guy died in 1993. Okay, he died in the early 90s. Let's be fair about that. I don't have the exact date. He died in the early 90s. He died before the digital era. All of his work was before the digital era. The article was certainly longer than anything I would have written based on the sources that I could find online, number one. Number two, what is there in print? In Washington, Encyclopedia of American Opera. That may be on Google Books. That's not digitized. So what's in there? Does Grok have access to that? I don't think it does. That's the question again about you're talking about AI. it's all well and good for it to be able to read stuff that's been digitized, but what about the stuff that hasn't been? Um, if we come to a point when the entirety of human literature is digitized, it's going to be thousands of years in the future because there's just so much of it. And that's to say nothing of questions like copyright. And so that's the one thing that comes up in a lot of my thinking about AI. AI is, I don't want to say it's acceptable, but it can create something based on digital sources. But that's never going to be an acceptable final product to me. What the human can do is weigh sources and review sources, but the human can also find the books, find the paper sources that need to be out there. And I maybe take this a little more broadly. I think a lot of editors don't think, well, no, that's not a fair point. I don't want to say a lot of editors don't think, but a lot of readers maybe don't think that a print source is just as valid and oftentimes is going to be the only thing you have. To go back to medieval Italian military commanders, there isn't really somebody out there who's writing an entire blog all about 11th century condottieri. I mean, maybe there is. I don't know. I don't judge. But a lot more of that stuff is going to be out there in histories from medieval Italy. And it's going to take, also, your point about academics, it's going to take human editors to tease that out. It's going to take academics to help define that notability, because academics are the ones who are able to write the books about medieval Italian history. And so when I'm looking for sources on whatever condottiero, or let's say, I can read the source, but it's the writer of the source who has justified why this person is notable. So another, to your point about working hand in hand and that sort of thing. I don't want to say too much more about AI for a variety of reasons, but the one thing the reason I'll never fully trust it is, even if it may convincingly think like a human, whether I believe that or not, I don't understand its thought processes. And I can't really interrogate its thought processes. And I know somebody will hear that and say, well, yes, you can. You can ask it a question. Its thought processes are going to be different than human thought processes. And I think you could never entirely eliminate the human. So
no, you really can't. And you also have to look at references and text and
right,
things
right.
have been written.
That's the major thing, is weighing things, weighing references, weighing texts, weighing their importance. It's the other thing about print sources, especially passion projects like this. I don't want to say unkind about Mr. Washington. He's dead, for one thing. I find some of these sources have errors in them. I have a wonderful, wonderful biographical dictionary of DC artists that I have used. Wonderful book. Error-riddled as hell. I mean, I've opened up and I found things that scream at me they're wrong. I understand why. The guy that created it was a gallerist by trade. It was a passion product for him. He spent much of his career compiling biographical history of DC art. He died a week after the first volume was published. He never even got a chance to look at a second volume, much less correct the first volume. But I can look at that and I can work with other sources and I can find, what looks likelier, what looks likelier to go with. I can weigh them. I'm not convinced that AI can do that.
No, not at all. I was wondering, first off, do you have a book in terms of how to write, or in terms of like Wikipedia 101? If not,
So,
would you be willing to write a book in terms of like, how to write a site?
I have not written one. I suppose I wouldn't mind writing one, but really, I think if you can write a blog post, you can write a Wikipedia article. It's pretty straightforward. It's just gather your sources, make sure you're not plagiarizing, and other than that, the notability guideline is there. I don't have that to hand, but you can look at that yourself, and you can determine notability based on that. I still use some of the precepts that I was taught back in history class in high school, much less college. They were enforced in college, so that's not saying anything against my college professors. But some of the research rules I was taught in high school 25 years ago, there was simple academic writing tools for papers, beginning with, and I still remember Ms. Jarvis, my junior year history teacher, Martha Jarvis, insisting you want 3 sources. Start with your 3 sources and then, go from there. But if you can't even get 3 sources to support something, then maybe it's, maybe you need to think about looking at something else. The sources are the most important thing. And that's an academic tenet, that's a scholarly tenet, and it's a Wikipedia tenet. And there's really no difference. So to your point, I'm not opposed to it, but I don't really see there would be much point to it. I think if you can write a blog post, or if you can write a school paper, you can write a Wikipedia article.
I don't know, Steven. I don't know. The reason why I say that is because I teach a research process and methods class at NYU, and I've always stressed you need 3 peer-reviewed articles. 3 peer-reviewed articles. And you know where these students are getting their articles from. Despite the fact I emphasize on the 3 peer-reviewed articles, they would get it from Fortune magazine, Forbes, New York Times, and I'm like, I tell them there's a distinction between what's being written in the press, trade sources, and also peer-reviewed, academic articles from the Journal of International, so that's basically that's why I'm like, I don't know. I think you still should be able to say, you know what, despite the fact that you should know how to cite correctly, you should know how to provide quality sources, right? Mm-hmm. 3 quality sources, but I think you still need someone to hold your hand and walk you through the process, because sometimes students or even new editors may say, you know what, 3 articles, I'll get them from. I can tell somebody, do they have somebody, a PR person that can write? All right. So I think that's why I'm like, even if you know that that's the standard, 3 peer-reviewed articles, people try to find ways to get around it and then say no.
But people are always going to try. I think the difference is there are some editors you can take them and say, look, that's an end run. You're not supposed to be doing that, and they'll understand that. But I honestly think that the kind of person that's doing that, because they want an article about themselves or whatever subject, they're going to look for other ways to do it anyway. They're not going to listen to the notability requirements because they've convinced themselves that they meet them and that they just have to prove that. But one point that you raise that I think about a lot now is with the changes in journalism and with the changes in the journalistic landscape, the nature of sources is going to have to start changing. And by which I mean, I'll give you an example. Used to be, if I was writing an article about a contemporary opera singer, I could likely find something in opera news that I could work on. Problem, opera news folded about 4 years ago. And so you have Opera Magazine, which is the general interest opera magazine, which is, we subscribe. Don't get me wrong. I love Opera Magazine. Sorry, but its focus is a little broader than Opera News's was. And a lot of it is review-based as opposed to interview-based. But they at least try to do an interview with somebody related to opera every issue. My point is, so opera has been there since 1956. Opera News used to be in parallel with it. Now it's not. I have just lost one of my 3 sources. I have just lost one of them with Opera News. And opera isn't exactly the most popular art form in the world. People aren't beating down the doors to write more publications about opera. What is out there? Blogs. There are blogs about opera, blogs about reviews, blogs about interviews. And I know people will hear me say this and say, no, you can't use blogs. You're not allowed to use blogs. Don't use blogs. I understand the reason for that. But at some point, I think you have to start acknowledging that the information landscape has changed enough that some blogs, not all of them, some blogs, though, are viable sources of at least some of the information that you need. I think about that specifically within opera, But I think that's going to be a bigger problem for a lot of fields coming up in the next 20 or 30 years, especially in the next 15 or 20, just because the information landscape has changed so much. Um, and to your point about peer reviewed, yeah, I'm sure. I don't want some garbage from somewhere, but there are review sites that I know that are blog review sites, which are as good as peer reviewed, because I know the people that write them. I trust what they've written, um, because I know their histories and I know their backgrounds. So that sort of thing is there. All of which is to say, maybe it's possible to be a little too doctrinaire sometimes about looking at all the sourcing information that you're looking at. And that's not to say that peer review is not important. That's not to say that verifiable information is not important. I certainly don't want to imply that. But that's to say that I think it's starting to change very substantially. I think we need to be aware of that.
I was wondering, are there, and this is basically out of my curiosity, the tiers in terms of what is qualified as a good source. A good source. Do you have an idea of like what tier are there? Tier 1, tier 2, or is it just a matter of like, trustworthy, qualitative source from either a blog or an article or an encyclopedia or a book somewhere?
Well, encyclopedias are usually about the top tier scholarly books, though I'm fond of telling a story about an article I wrote some years ago. To cut it somewhat brief, and people who know me, they'll laugh at that. I was writing an article about a woman in the Mississippi legislature that said she had attended University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I don't know the founding dates of many universities in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but just by chance, I had been reading about Mary Washington a day or two previous. And I said, that's funny. She can't have graduated from there because it didn't exist when it says she graduated. Well, I sliced and sliced and sliced. And after about an hour, I found actually in an online source, it said she graduated from Martha Washington College, which was a girls' finishing school, not a formal university. That was out in Abingdon, Virginia, and that closed back in the 30s sometime. That was the only source I had, but because I know some things about the Southern aristocracy and her background and things, it all lined up. Because she was from the right kind of background that went there. She was the right kind of person to have gone there, and so on and so forth. Martha Washington College in Virginia. I could see exactly what was happening. Somebody in the editing process looked at that and said, no, there's no Martha Washington College in Virginia. Well, no, there isn't. It's a hotel now. It's the Martha Washington Inn. So there's no Martha Washington College in Virginia. But I've heard of Mary Washington College, which, of course, that's University of Mary Washington now. So, and here we are. Great. So she went to school she never went to. And that made it into a publication. I think it was University of Mississippi. Don't quote me on that. It was a university press publication, a scholarly publication on women's participation in politics in the American South. The point I'm making going down that long rabbit hole is even a scholarly book has potential errors in it. And any editor and any writer should be aware of that. I also realize that it's my own luck that if I could have breezed right by that without knowing, because it just happened to be University of Mary Washington, happened to be on the top of my mind. That being said, scholarly publications, encyclopedias, usually the top tier. For newspapers, it's going to be stuff like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And there is actually some discussion sometimes about what sources are depreciated and what newspapers are acceptable, which ones are not. My general feeling, though, is you know it when you see it. Anybody who writes an article who's got scholarly interest, again, to point to my Encyclopedia of American Opera, I don't just write articles from encyclopedias. I read them because they're fun. And when I start reading a book like that, and there's one error, I say, oh, okay. Then I catch a second. When I start catching more and more errors, it tells me this is a usable source, but I need to weigh it more closely. Versus, say, New Grove. So there's always going to be variation within the strata that you're talking about. I know some editors discount blogs entirely. I tend not to, because a lot of blogs have more niche information, but they focus on something that people are very interested in. And while it's true, it's true that maybe not as properly peer reviewed. It's also true, I think, that no self-respecting blogger is going to let a lot of howlers out there, because it depreciates their own credibility. So
I was going to say that. Also, as a scholar and as an academic, we tend to be positive and objective in terms of what we do. I'm pretty sure. Is it the same in terms of how you would, look at a Wikipedia profile?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure. I'm not above including a line of criticism or two, but generally speaking, if I'm writing, like, say, about an artist, a composer, I want that in there under the rubric of critics have said, and it'll be a direct quote. I don't put it in there to express my own opinion. It's just sometimes it's helpful to add a little bit of critical flavor, and that will be, as I say, something that I quote directly. No, generally speaking, you have to be objective, and you have to be aware to make sure that your sources are objective.
I was wondering, when it comes down to schools closing down now, right? There are schools closing down, and perhaps you may have one or two people that may have went to those schools that may not be notable now, but perhaps they may be notable in the future.
So notable in the future, that's one thing, but notability is held to be permanent. So if you were notable once by the encyclopedia standard, you will remain notable. Notable in the future, there's a page, Wikipedia crystal ball. I can't look in the crystal ball and make those judgments. It shouldn't necessarily have anything to do with schooling, though. Notability is derived from many sources, and your educational background really shouldn't be one of them. I mean, I have to say that I went to school that produced 3 presidents, and we're very proud of them. But just off the top of my head, I think Warren Harding. We can debate his importance, but Warren Harding graduated from a school that no longer exists. And I know he wasn't the only president who graduated from a university that no longer exists. And yet no one would argue that Warren Harding isn't notable. And he was a graduate from Ohio Central College. It doesn't really even say in the Wikipedia article when the college folded. So, okay. So, but to your question about schools that are closing, no one would argue that Warren Harding isn't notable. So, but I think very few people would argue very much about where he went to school.
That's interesting. Yep, that's interesting. I was wondering, when it comes down to your history of volunteer, and this is a volunteering work that you're doing at Wikipedia, right? You're not getting paid. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering, what was your favorite article that you have ever worked on?
So favorite article that I've created, there are probably several candidates, but one I like to come back to was about a woman named Joanna Quiner, who was only 2 American women sculptors born in the 18th century are known, and Quiner was the second. I was always very interested in women artists, and especially if you look at the history of 19th century sculpture in the United States, you have a lot of notable women. For the time, you have a lot of women who were able to make careers. Harriet Hosmer, for instance, Edmonia Lewis, Anne Whitney. Vinnie Ream was very, very interesting. Vinnie Ream carved a statue of Abraham Lincoln for the U.S. Capitol building. Quiner was a little bit older than them, but she came from a working class background. She, it's a great story. She was a housekeeper in Boston at the Boston Athenaeum, and the children of the Athenaeum's director were having sculpture lessons. And apparently, at the age of 40 or something, so she's past prodigy stage is what I mean by that. She's at an age when you think that her working world is locked in. But she was watching these sculpture lessons. Apparently, she's standing there and saying, yeah, I could do that. And the sculptor said, oh, why don't you? And he put some plaster in front of her. And she created a bust. And he looked at it and said, that's not half bad. I'm going to teach you. And he did. And she created a few sculptures. She exhibited in Boston for a while. But unlike a lot of her contemporaries, she never took off. And she ultimately went back to housekeeping, moved back to Beverly, which is where she was from, and she died in her sister's household. It's a very, very interesting story. And it's a very interesting story because it's a little bit counter a lot of the women's stories of the early 19th century. You look at Harriet Hosmer, Edmonia Lewis. The story is she succeeded in spite of the odds. Quiner did not. I'd never heard of her. And I have a book of American women sculptors by Charlotte Zimmerman. Excuse me.
Very good.
Yeah, Charlotte Rubinstein. I like to make sure I get these things correct. She's in there. Rubinstein makes several suggestions that perhaps because she was working class, she had a different background. She was taught from a young age, don't throw elbows, don't make trouble. And so she would have had to push her way further into society. She didn't want to do that. But Rubinstein is the first historian I've ever heard to really talk about her. And all of a sudden, he said, I did an entire class on 19th century American art. She wasn't part of it. I've been able to write her back into the narrative a little bit more. And I'm sure she's probably in a couple of other encyclopedias as well. But I'd never encountered her. And that's ultimately the beauty of this to me, is you can write about people you wouldn't otherwise have encountered. So she's the one. The other thing I've enjoyed is I've got an encyclopedia of American folk art. And my choir also does a lot of shape note, which, if you're not familiar with, is a traditional singing style that's long associated with the South and communities, some of them in the Midwest, which has not been the subject of as much scholarly attention. And certainly the composers haven't been. So I've been able to write articles about some shape note composers as well. Once again, putting people back into the narrative that weren't necessarily in the narrative. And that's one of the things that I think Wikipedia does very well. And to have these things out there that people then can write about, that people can then read and study and translate. We were talking about geography earlier. About 13 or 14 years ago, I had an idle afternoon at work. So I created some articles about the community councils of Lesotho, which are like the second level population divisions after provinces. And they've been translated now into 4 or 5 languages, including Ukrainian is the one that I remember. That's information that wasn't available in Ukrainian, and now it is. And I've done something to facilitate that. That's an amazing feeling.
With the contributions that you made, do you feel and do you think that you have a sense of responsibility to those who may be reading about whether the subject itself? Do you think you have that responsibility to owe it to them to say, this is factual, objective information?
Sure.
Okay.
I think any editor feels that way. You have to you have to take responsibility that what you're saying is factual, that what you're saying is true. And you also have to take responsibility that what you're talking about is notable. If I write an article about something or someone, it's because I think that's an article that needs to be written. Others may disagree. That's what the deletion process is there for. But if I've chosen to, it's because I think it's an article that needs to be written. And I certainly take responsibility for any of the material in the article. I want it to be as accurate as possible.
And I was wondering, when was the last time you had an article that you have written been deleted?
A couple of weeks ago, actually. And I knew it was a bit of a borderline when I wrote it, but it's an article about an artist from Georgia. I still might argue, but of course, as I say, I thought she was notable. I wrote an article about her. But the problem in Georgia is that there are very few sources available online for Georgian art. And so, once again, I don't know, but there's a couple of books out there that might have bolstered my claim, and I simply didn't have access to them. This is oftentimes in deletion discussions, that's in the ones that I get involved in, the things that I've written, that's often the problem. We're looking at something that's just so obscure that anything that might be usable is probably in a book that's 50 or 100 years old and that hasn't been digitized yet.
Where did you get that pseudonym from?
So Ser Amantio di Nicolao is a fairly minor character in Puccini's Gianni Schicchi. I don't know why, but I've always been sort of interested in the older style Italian names, so some of the Renaissance names that you run into, for instance. But Ser Amantio is the lawyer. If I remember my Italian correctly, Ser Amantio di Nicolao, just Ser means that he is a member of society in some standing. It's like Mr. Amantio is his name, and then Di Nicolao, his father would have been named Nicolao. So he's just the lawyer that shows up to write Boso Donati's will at the end of Gianni Schicchi. I am a great opera lover, and Schicchi is one of my favorite operas. I was originally Albert Herring, after Benjamin Britten's opera character. I won't get into... I love Britten's operas, but Albert Herring is not my favorite. Mostly I grabbed that one because I was sort of panicky and didn't have a name in mind, and it was my pseudonym somewhere else. But I like Ser Amantio. Something about names in that style always amused me, and so when I had the chance to change, I changed. For those who know the opera, the link in my signature, you put links to your talk page and to your contributions and other things if you want. So the link to my talk page is "Che dicono la signa?" What do they say in Signa? And then the link to my contributions is "Lo dicono la signa?" That's what they say in Signa, which is the first joke in the opera that as the relatives gather for Boso's death, they start gossiping and say, "Wait a minute, what are they saying in Signa?" That's what they're saying in Signa, and it all goes from there. So,
but also wanted to talk about. I know you're a good singer as well.
I like to think I am. My choir director keeps me around, so I guess.
Yeah, so I think that's probably what piqued your interest in terms of opera and
Well, my late father was an opera lover, and I'd been going to the opera since I was 5. Beat him by 10 years. He was going since he was 15. Now, my father was also a choral singer, and we had the music and we had the opera on in the house all the time growing up. Also, one of my first encyclopedias he owned the Encyclopedia of Music and Musicians. It was a dictionary of music and musicians by David Mason Green, who is delightfully irreverent and influenced a lot of the way I think proper writing should be done. He was amusing and clever, and he was also very fact-driven. He understood that you don't have to sacrifice the facts for a good gag once in a while. Also, apparently, he was something of an eccentric. I have a friend who actually knew him growing up. But so I grew up surrounded by music and surrounded by encyclopedias. We also have an encyclopedia downstairs. It's a Soviet theatrical encyclopedia. I don't know the full story, but I understand that my parents may have retrieved it from being thrown out at some point. And it's a 50s Soviet publication. It's a very, very interesting window into that period of Soviet life. And of course, I can't read Russian, so I can't read it as well as I'd like. But it's sitting there waiting to be translated someday.
I was also wondering, as far as, you read lots of encyclopedias, but books, in terms of what type of books do you like to read, or what type of genre of work that you tend to,
So read? I try to be as broadly read as possible. I go for broad rather than deep. I'm working on some Schiller right now. I realized a few years ago I really don't have a good handle on German Romantic writing, and so for my birthday I asked for several Schiller plays, and I'm working my way through Don Carlos right now. Got some more to go. Before that, I want to make sure I get his name right. African writer. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Is Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Yeah.
I read one of his novels, The River Between, recently. Um, I I try to stick mostly to what are considered quote unquote classics. Um, but as I say, I try to be broadly read. I think it's first of all, good literature and popular literature is a window into a culture that you can't get just from studying it otherwise. To read a novel is to read what a culture has determined to be important to them. And not just. I've read some epic poetry over the years. I read some as diverse as Vietnamese and Kyrgyz over the past couple of years. Penguin Modern Classics is very, very useful for this sort of thing. I do enjoy a good murder mystery, though I don't tend to like modern ones. Um, I don't read a lot of contemporary fiction in general. Last year, probably the two newest novels I read were by Joyce Carol Oates and Dom DeLillo, both from the mid '80s. I don't know. I think there's a lot of older stuff that is still interesting and still to be read before I consider anything new. But I do read a lot of American literature, early 20th century American, mid-century American. My very favorite writer is Saul Bellow. I know there are probably people who will have some things to say about that too, but I don't know of anybody whose prose is as dazzling as Bellows is to me. Bernard Malamud is a favorite as well. Robert Penn Warren. I loved All the King's Men. It's been almost 20 years since I've read that. Also, talking of Southern literature, one of my favorites is Ellen Glasgow, whom I would insist belongs in the same breath as people like Faulkner. I know why she's not, but again, that's a very, very different discussion about Southern letters and Southern views of writers like Glasgow and non-Southern views of writers like Glasgow. But as I say, I try to be fairly broadly read. When I'm coming back on my own towards center, it's more American literature. Because I am an American and I feel it's very important to know my own literary heritage. But that doesn't mean that I shut other things out as well. I'm also, for the past couple of years, I've been reading a lot more drama than usual. Because something I realized some years ago was that I really don't know drama at all. I barely know American theater, and I certainly don't know world theater. So Schiller, I read some Lope de Vega, some Gozzi, and some Goldoni. And I still have more on the shelf to come back to from time to time. So anyways, like I said, I try mostly fiction. I read comparatively little nonfiction, but I try to be as broadly read as possible.
I was wondering. I think you said you taught before. Have you ever taught in a university or?
No.
Okay.
My parents were both academics.
Okay.
My parents taught language and literature. My mother taught English language and literature before she emigrated from the Soviet Union, and then she taught Russian here. And my father taught Russian at various universities, and they both taught at the Defense Language Institute. No, I have not taught.
I was wondering if you had the opportunity to teach, which subject or which major or which subject you would teach.
Well, my degree is in art history, and I would want to do something with art history, most likely. I think there's a lot, in theory, one could do with that at the high school level, actually. But and that's all I'll say, because I have very strong feelings about the way that the education system is codified, especially at the middle and high school levels, and that's why I've never pursued it. Because if I did pursue it, I would say I want, in essence, to have a fairly free hand to teach the way that I think I need to be teaching. And I'm not sure you can have that. As I say, I try very hard not to say unkind things in interviews, because A, they'll come back to bite me. B, I don't like being unkind. I have strong opinions, but I don't like being unkind. I think it's not a way of life that I think is very useful.
I totally understand. For me myself, I really don't like teaching in terms of from a textbook or especially a textbook that I didn't write. Now, if it's for point of reference, it's different, but I like a free hand in terms
Yeah.
of teaching and disseminating information as well. As far as I know we don't have much time here. If there's one thing in terms of, let's say, an aspiring editor or someone who's into history and they followed your work, they're a big fan of who you are as well. I was wondering, is there one piece of advice that you would give to them?
Yeah, if you're interested in editing, just jump in with both feet. I mean, pay attention, of course. If people are telling you you're doing something wrong, don't get combative. If people are being combative with you and telling you you're doing something wrong, don't get combative. But I like to refer to it as sitting in the corner and watching. Watch what's going on in front of you, because that's how I learned. But if you think you have something to contribute, or if you're interested in contributing something, please jump in, because there's still so much that's left to be done, that's left to be improved, that's left to be edited. And there's a role for any kind of editor to play, whether you're a photographer or a copy editor or a researcher, whatever they may be. There's certainly something there that you can do. Just get in there and get your hands dirty and start learning what needs to be done. And that's without even talking about the other languages, because we're sticking to English right now. Because there's I think 100 plus other language editions of Wikipedia out there. There's a lot to be done in that realm if you're willing to sit down and do some of the work to do it. I have a lot of thoughts about things that projects that can be begun in the next 25 years too. But again, it's way beyond the scope of this discussion. Find a niche to start working on and just get your hands dirty and start doing it.
Sounds good. Well, this is the Academic Boardroom, and we are signing out right now.
The mind of a scholar and a business-minded soul. We at the Academic Boardroom, yeah, we keeping it 100. If you're looking for the truth, well, you finally found it. Take a seat at the head, let the dialogue flow. It's the Masterclass 5, if you didn't, now you know.